welcome to our book club episode this week. We'll get there. So our grand plan had been to cover chapters 4 and 5 this week. But yeah, last week we, mostly Megan, had way too many notes and we didn't get through our first chunk of content. So today is part 2 of last week's book club episode, and we'll be discussing chapters 2 and 3 of The Homeschooler's Guide to Portfolios and Transcripts. So that's this bad boy, if you're actually watching on YouTube. Okay, he's giant, but filled with some pretty good information, more or less depending on which one of us you ask. To make sure that we fit all of our notes in this week, we're going to dive right in. So Megan's got the first talking point. We're all shocked. What do you have for us?
We will get back on some sort of a schedule. All right, so we're starting chapter 2, which starts on page 13. I was really proud of myself. I didn't have any notes for page 13. I made it all the way to the top of page 14 before I had my first note, which I loved this point because, and in our main episode of this week, we talked a lot about kindergarten and traditional education and things like that. And we kind of looked at alternative ways to learn writing and reading and all of that, right? And I liked in the book here, it talks about ways that you can evaluate learning, because I think a lot of times the traditional thought process is, I need to have a test. I need to test them. I need to quiz them. They need to write a paper. I think those are probably the first two things that come up is tests, papers. And the reality is there are so many ways that you can measure learning and you can evaluate learning that are more productive for your learner, that are more fun for both of you. I mean, who wants to grade tests? So, there's a really cool example here. It says, if you want to know whether a student understands electric circuits, you can have him or her, take a paper and pencil test. That's still a thing, still exists. You could have them draw a diagram of different types of circuits. You could design and conduct an experiment with batteries and bulbs. You could engage in dialogue about the subject. You could ask them to write directions for other people on how to do something, which is a huge way to measure understanding, because sometimes even when you're really good at something, it's hard to explain it to other people. So that's a different level of thinking altogether. And you could also ask them to diagnose why the computer's new printer isn't properly installed. I do have to say, though, that could just be that you have an asshole printer. Does anybody else have an asshole printer? I swear, I will send stuff to the printer, it prints. I send another document, can't find printer. It's right freaking there. I'm looking at it. It's right there.
It's still right where it was.
You just sent stuff to it a minute ago. Now you can't find it? What the fuck? So, yeah, that could just be the printer. I'm just saying. I hate ours. It's evil. But anyway, the overall concept I loved, right? That it doesn't have to be that thing. Book reports, there's so many studies that have been done about book logs and book reports and things like that not being an ideal measurement for learners, and honestly how it's killing the love of reading for so many kids also by turning reading into this epic chore. But we have a tendency to just have conversations. We were coming home yesterday, my youngest Ben's at the farmer's market, and we were driving home yesterday and I was explaining to him how my whole world is tilted off its axis because I finished the book I was listening to and I was so in love with it. And so on the way home, he helped me flip through my to be read list because I was driving and kind of read out some descriptions. And then we listened to some audio samples together. And he's not going to listen to the book, but he does pick up little bits and pieces. And I have a tendency to listen to mostly World War II books. And he loves all the characters' names and how with so much flair the narrators read them, and he'll be like, so is this a book with Philippe or Jacques, and like all this kind of stuff. And he's like, I'm only going to pick a book if it has a really good main character. And then that inevitably leads to a conversation about a character in his book and something that's going on in his book. And so you can have these really organic conversations about different things without it being this really formal structured testing process. I mean, listen, if you have a classroom of 15 or 20 kids, or you're teaching middle school or high school, and then in that case classes are rotating, and then you have like 200 kids, or you're a principal of a school with 1,000 kids, at some point organic conversation isn't going to work very well. It's going to be really hard to measure and assess a person's learning through anecdotal conversations over a nice cup of tea. But when you're homeschooling, that's, in my mind, one of the best ways to do it, because you could have a kid who gets test anxiety. You could have a kid who's not great at testing, all of the above. You have to make the test. They have to take the test. It's a whole thing. I mean, if you love testing, okay, but like, that's not the only way that you can do things. There's so many alternatives, and for us, better ways. Not for everybody, but for us, better ways. So
Yeah.
love Loved it.
Yeah, and I thought these were all great examples. One thing that I want to expand on a little is the testing, right? Because we're academic homeschoolers, we're quite aggressively academic homeschoolers. We do some testing. Um, but two of the most common ways for us to do it in our house is one, for my kiddo to write the test for me to take, right? Because it's that thing. He has to know the material. He's got to come up with some multiple choice questions. His goal is to stump me, so he's going to make it as hard as possible. And so, if it's something that's a small lesson and you're wanting to test reading comprehension, one of the best ways you can do that is to say, like, write a test for me, see if you can stump me, because it's flipping that and they're really showing there, and it's changing that dynamic. And then a second way is we do almost all of our tests open book in our house, because in this day and age, it is not nearly as important for you to have memorized everything as it is for you to remember that you can always go find the resources you need, and to practice that on a regular. That is a skill that you need to develop, and you need to be able to quickly find the resources or the information you need to be able to make this decision or to make this next step or to know where to go next. And constantly practicing that is
Mm-hmm.
far more useful in the real world and in your job and just life in general than to be able to sit down and regurgitate stuff on a test that, do you ever really need to know how many times are you going to be in a position where you're like, I don't know the date for that. Um, Let me look it up, versus I don't know for the date for that and there's nothing we can do about it. you know?
The world has ended. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Yeah. My kiddo in his college semester last semester had open book finals in some of his classes. Not all of them, but some of them were open book finals that he was able to use. And the school gives you the textbooks, and then on top of it, they have physical copies of the textbooks on the room in the classroom too, to make them accessible for everyone without a bananas expense. And so he was able to just go grab a book off the shelf and take his final using a book. It was great. Does he know the information? Heck yeah. He totally knew the information, but tests don't have to be what the school has made them to be. So, and I love the fact that your kiddo writes you tests. That sounds like so up his alley. I love that.
Yep.
That's so fun.
All right. So the next one is me. Yeah. Um,
Look at you,
so,
3 in a row. Oh, people
uh,
in glass houses. I'm just saying.
all right. So I was on page 16, and on page 16, actually page 16 and 17, there's an exercise, and it's called Understanding What a Portfolio Does. And exercise number one, creating a mini portfolio. And I just thought that it was really interesting. So it says, go to somewhere in your home that's reflective of who you are, sit down and make yourself comfortable. Look around, your eyes will linger on something, write its name next to number one. Turn in another direction, your eyes will notice something else. Write this down as number two. Turn around again and write down the third item, and so on and so on. And then it says, perhaps you will feel that something or someone ought to be included but is missing. Make this your number five or your number six. And then beneath each of the items, note why you chose it and what it reveals. And and then after you've done this whole thing, it says, congratulations, you've just developed a sample portfolio. But it was a good example of that thing of, it doesn't have to be as hard or as complicated as we make it. Look around, pick the things that stand out the most, and then make a note about why it stands out the most to you. And then think about whether or not you've missed something, and for me, that might be travel, and I might not have picked that up by, because my passport's not just laying out, it's tucked away, kind of thing, or wherever I'm sitting, there might not be a travel guide that I can easily see. But that's important, and so just like kind of an easy way to sift through all of this information, and we get so overwhelmed. So I think that was a great activity to help someone who is not doing any type of portfolio, to help them get in the mindset of what exactly is a portfolio. Great, fun, easy. I mean, you could do this in less than 10 minutes, no problem at all. And to really just kind of get in the right headspace and thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I liked
Uh,
that one as well.
yeah. And so then my next note was on 18, and that's under a section called What a Portfolio Isn't. The quote is, all too often I hear parents say they need to go in for a portfolio review and that the principal wants them to bring in everything. Not at all. Now, I will say caveat, maybe in California, if you're with a charter school, that does sometimes happen. We talked about that before. But a portfolio is a carefully chosen selection, not the whole kit and caboodle. And so again, if you're in the California charter system, they may ask you to bring in everything, and they really do mean they want to see the textbooks that you're using, the workbooks that you're using. And that's just to make sure, because you're getting state funding, you have to use secular materials. And so they want to make sure that you do actually have secular materials that cover all of the different areas that you have to have, because there's been a little bit of an uptick in people being like, oh, well, how do I trick them and actually use non-secular materials and this and that? So they're having to be a little bit more careful about at least occasionally checking and making sure that you're actually really using the type of materials that you've said you are, because you signed an agreement saying you were using them. But that's a whole other exception, right? If you're not in one of those states where you're getting state funding and you have to have secular materials, for the most part, you're bringing in a portfolio, it's a portfolio review. It's a small selection of honestly just their best work, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is not the stuff that you bring that shows like, well, they need to make progress or they're making progress in this area. Like, you just bring a few examples of the best stuff that they've done and be like, hey, look, my kid's awesome. We checked all your boxes. Now we're going to go home and keep doing what we do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, keep it simple, right? I mean, last week we talked a little bit about my hesitation to engage with the public school system as a result of the trauma that my oldest child had in the public school system, not because I've got my tinfoil hat on and I'm afraid of the government, but because of my actual experience. But yeah, if they're not asking for it, I'm not saying don't give it to them because we should be hiding information or, withholding things or whatever of that nature, but just we're busy. Like, why create more work for yourself than you need? If they're not asking for it, don't put yourself through it. You do not need it. I promise you when we get to so our reading here has mostly focused on portfolio, but when we get to the transcript section, like we talked about it last week, a transcript is a really like 50,000 foot view of your kid's education. Nobody's ever going to come back to you if you don't live in a portfolio state and all you have to do is the transcript at the end. Nobody's ever going to be like, what math did you do on May 27th of 2022? No one's going to ask you that. So if no one's requiring you to keep that level of detail, why are you making your life harder than it needs to be? Don't, if you don't want to. You don't have to. If you're doing it because you love it, do it. If you're doing it because you're afraid you might need it someday, you're not going to.
Yeah. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't work for you, find another way that does, because that is what homeschooling is about, finding the way that actually works and doesn't create more anxiety or more work or unnecessary work. It just doesn't need to be that way. Now, that said, I have another activity for you that you should totally do. So on page 20, there's the exercise number 2, and it's a collage portfolio. So this is essentially what we now call vision boarding. I don't know if you did, I can't remember that book. I don't know. In the early 2000s, it was a really big one, big deal. And it was all about vision boarding. But so the idea is you collect and select. And so it says collect the materials, have your kids essentially, create a collage reflecting what they want or what interests them. Like just make a collage out of materials, whatever they want, right? Whatever it looks like. Okay, fine. I'm with that. And that can be an interesting activity. The part that really got me though, that I hadn't thought about was to actually really think about, step back and look at what your kiddo has put together and observe the process. So it says, did you use the whole piece of poster board or just some of it? Did you fold it? Did you cut it? Did you use scissors to cut the pictures out of the magazines and catalogs, or did you just rip them out? Did you paste down the whole pictures? Did you cut out specific parts of the pictures? Did you make sure you glued all the way around the edges of the pictures, or were the edges, did they stick out? Were they floppy? Were there three-dimensional objects on there? Did you include words or phrases or only pictures? Did things overlap? or were they all neat and orderly? Was it a border around your paper, around your poster board? Or, I mean, there's just so many things to think about, and it gives you so much insight into your kid and how they work, how they see the world. And you may be amazed at what you come away from this realizing, like, hey, I'm being too structured. Or maybe you look at it and you go, good Lord, my kid clearly needs more organization. If I was doing this, they would absolutely, I'd tear them out and then I might tidy up the edges, but there'd definitely be overlap. Like my pictures would be overlapped. There'd be, it'd be a true collage kind of look. And I bet there's a pretty good chance my kid, they'd be ordered and there wouldn't be any overlap and there'd be white space and things like that, which would not be included in mine. And that's an example of the fact that he needs more order and structure in his life than I tend to, right? And then some really easy things you could pick up without having to spend too much time, right? I think it's a great activity. That's exercise 2 and 3, and it goes between pages 20 and 21.
Yeah, I think it's as soon as you said about ripping pictures out of a magazine, I had this kind of instant flashback to a very stressful instance where one of my kids, so we're typically not cereal eaters, but now that my 16-year-old has a driver's license, I'll send him to the store for me sometimes, and he always brings back a little treat for himself. He's always got a cookie or something. It's hilarious to see what he brings home. So anyway, he brought home a box of cereal one day, and it was open on the counter, and I went to go fold it down and put it away. And it looked like a pack of hungry rabid raccoons had chewed through the opening of this box. And I was like, I wanted a DNA test. I was like, there is no way that you are my child when you have opened a cereal bag like this. Like, you lift the bag up, you take a scissor, you cut an angled line so that the cereal funnels out and you can neatly fold it down. And I was like, so when you said ripped pictures out, I was like, oh yeah, no, we're not doing that. That's like the cereal bag. I can't, right? So I'm like, it's true. What you can tell about people is so different from little things like that.
It is, right? And remembering that just because this is your way and this is what works for you, it doesn't mean that this is what works for your kiddo. And so this is an easy thing to help you really take that step back and be like, oh yeah, we're different. And how do we find that middle ground between, clawing open the cereal bag and actually being able to have other people use it without making a mess on the floor and the counter? Like, there's compromise in there.
Yeah, we didn't reach it that. I mean, I shouldn't say we didn't reach it that day. It was his box of cereal. It's not even a cereal that I like. He's the only one that was going to like that cereal, so he's the only one so it didn't affect anybody. But I just remember being like, oh my gosh, I was like, I can't even believe you opened something like this. Oh, anyway, it was not good. So we are touching a little bit on transcripts in this section. I feel like we haven't read this book before. We talked about that last week. So I feel like eventually we'll get more into transcript heavy work because this is very portfolio heavy, which is fine. I'm loving it, as you know. But I thought it was really interesting. I just love wordplay and kind of the origins of words and things like that. So there's a small little bit on 22 that talks about the concept of a high school or college transcript being a little bit ironic because in the court system, a trial transcript contains every single word, right? It's almost like a screenplay where it's like so-and-so stood up, so-and-so sat, and it's got everything being in there letter for letter. Whereas an academic transcript is the absolute bare bones minimum, the name, the grade, done. And so if you are in a transcript only sort of homeschool environment, yeah, you do not need a ton of detail on there. I do have a little bit of detail on mine because I shouldn't say I felt like putting it. I talked to somebody who said it would probably be good because he was graduating early and blah, blah, blah. So I did it. I shouldn't say I was fine with it. I was actually pretty hostile about it. The whole time I was working on it, I was like, why do I have to write down what we did? Can I just say we studied the civil rights movement? And I think that just comes from the difference in our homeschool environments between you and I, Amanda, because I never had to answer to anybody really. And so the fact that then all of a sudden I had to be writing down what we were doing instead of just being like, we're good, leave us alone. It was a strange environment for me, but I did it. I got through it. It's all good. His transcript's lovely.
Well, and that flows in perfectly to the quote that I pulled out on page 23, right? Because on page 23 it says, "This is where homeschoolers' transcripts can shine. We are not limited to only letters and numbers. Sure, we can create quantitative transcripts with grades A to F, but we can also create qualitative transcripts that tell colleges and employers what they want to know, what this young person knows and can do." And so it's that thing. Yeah, okay, in some ways it is proving that you did what that you covered the things they needed to know because they were homeschooled and not in a public school. And apparently, if they're in a public school, just because you say they attended the class means that they learned all of those things. But we do also a lot of times put things on a transcript that don't exactly align up with what they would have had in
Mhm.
a public school, right? And so if you've got some kind of a unique title that covers your history, your geography, or something like that, like we talked about last week, and how you could use niche interest led learning, you can put a little, not a lot, right? We're not talking about a whole giant paragraph, but you can put a little information about what was included and what you covered so that when admissions people or whoever's looking at it, they look at it like, oh, wow, like, oh, they studied that, they analyzed that, like, oh, that's interesting. And it can really open a door to, like, oh, I want to talk to the kid who analyzed this or who has already studied that, like how many kids actually studied that in high school, or the flip side is they might look at it and be like, yeah, that we're not the right fit for this kid. And you would much rather know that than after you spent your first semester tuition and your kid is like, why am I here? This school does not get me, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. That's exactly what I was thinking. I'm like, it's kind of like that saying, like when people tell you who they are, believe them the first time, right? That's the
Mhm.
same thing. Like if they're saying we're not a fit, believe them. We're not a fit. Great. There's plenty of places that you are a fit, and that's where you
Mhm.
belong instead of feeling like a salmon who swims upstream all day.
Yep.
Yeah. So you were talking about creating classes, and there's a section in one of these kind of call out boxes on 24 about creating classes, and taking your unique learning experience or the way that you've kind of pieced together things for your learner to create a course. And I just wanted to add here, because this book is about 20 years old and I don't really find it super out of date, but obviously there's no mention of AI in a 20-year-old book. So I just kind of added a little thing there that I am a huge proponent of Chat GPT. I love it. There's a time and a place, obviously. There's an ethical way to use it and an unethical way to use it, but I love it. And so I will put in, when I did my son's transcript, put in a whole slew of stuff like, okay, these are like the 40 things that we did related to the civil rights movement. Give it a title, please, and give me a 2 to 3 sentence description for it. Boom. And if you don't like the answer that it gives you, you can hit the little refresh button. It'll just keep coming up with more. Sometimes it'll come up with something. Sometimes it gets really stuck on one word that it likes to put in everything. And I'll be like, I don't like that word, but it's in every choice. And so then I'll take my original blurb that I put in and say, can you please give me a title that doesn't include the word blah? And and then I'll make it redo it again by getting rid of that word. Because sometimes, AI is still learning. It's always going to be learning. And so sometimes when you hit refresh, it's still refreshing with the same like churn and burn ideas. And so you just have to kind of be like, no, that's not it, right? And just retweak your entry a little bit, but it gives you great suggestions and it's really great at kind of condensing down really big ideas into digestible content, which I love.
Yeah, no, that's a great tip, right? Because it's a lot of times it's much easier to write a big paragraph than it is to write two
Mm-hmm.
succinct sentences.
Yeah, and I think we're very close to it because as a homeschool parent, you want to be like, and then we did this, and then we did that, and it was so awesome, and we had so much fun, and we did an experiment, and it's like you
Mhm.
can't do that. So AI is obviously doesn't have the same emotional connection to your experience that you do, and so it'll be really good at just shrinking it down into the space that it needs to be.
Yeah, no, I can totally see that.
Yeah. I made a note on page 27 that there's a piece there that reminded me of our very first recording that we ever did together for the podcast, Amanda, and it had a very sentimental moment for me because you brought up in our first ever episode about finding one of the challenges being finding the challenge point.
Mhm.
And there's something there that reminded me of you.
Yeah, there is that call out box. Yeah. And so it says there's a box that says how hard should it be? Recreational level, too easy. Frustration level, too hard. Challenge or growth level, just right. Um, and yeah, there are absolutely times, right, that you do things at a recreational level. My kiddo absolutely has plenty of things he enjoys, and sometimes things that I just ask him to do that I know are too easy. But we're double checking, we're covering the basics again because it's summer. In fact, in the summer we do that, right? He's realistically he's a couple years ahead in math. He's a couple grade levels, I guess, ahead in math. But every summer we do what would be a normal bridge summer curriculum of math just to make sure that we didn't miss anything because he enjoys a certain type of math. And in doing that, actually I just discovered that he is actually still kind of struggling with specific types of graphs and getting information from specific types of graphs. And that is, it's not a surprise to me because realistically the math curriculum he's using isn't focusing on that at all, and it's doing very, very little with that. But I don't think I would have necessarily picked up on it otherwise because we don't have a lot of times in our life where it's like, hey, please look at that graph and let me know how many apples we need to buy at the store, or something like that. So it was, you know, that was a recreational level activity. The vast majority of it was super easy, but I was able to pick out a point of like, you know what, I should get an extra workbook on that for us to do this summer to make sure that we just tweak up, brush up on that just a little bit. But yeah, in homeschool life, you get to do one-on-one education. You get to do individualized learning and find that challenge or growth level in everything. So yeah. Obviously, I have a soapbox on that one too. I have a lot of soapboxes. All right. I had a comment with, let's see, on this same page, I had a quote. So, it's the exact, almost the same one. So, just under how hard should it be, it says, at the secondary school level, a student's research-based knowledge on a topic may surpass that of the teacher or parent. In a good performance, the student shares material that informs the adults, and in doing so blurs the line between teacher and learner. And isn't that, I mean, people are afraid of that, right? People and people outside of homeschooling, they're always like, well, what are you going to do when you don't know the material and they're ahead of you? But in an ideal world, even in a public school setting, kids are going to find an interest in something. They're going to research it. And when they present their research, ideally, they found something that teaches their teacher something new, right?
Yeah.
They deep dived on something, and the teacher's like, wow, you really went all in. I didn't even know that about that thing. It is no different. You can do that with a parent in a homeschool setting too. And that's the glory of education and learning, right? You get excited about something, you learn way more than you ever thought you would know. And as parents, you're blown away like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Tell me more about that crazy, interesting fact that you found.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. I mean, my kids have taught me so much through our very untraditional version of homeschool. They'll bring me stuff and they're like, and it's so funny because my 12-year-old is he's a sensory seeker in a lot of ways, and so that also constitutes information and having stimulation all the time. And so he just knows the oddest, most random things ever on the most whacked out topics. And I've stopped questioning him, but he used to tell me stuff and I'd in my head be like, clearly he made that up. Like there's no way that's true. And then secretly I would Google it. He was right every freaking time. And it would be the weirdest stuff. And I'm like, all right, kids. So I finally just stopped. I'm like, oh, he knows what he's talking about. I don't know where he gets this stuff from, but he knows what he's talking about.
This is a perfect example. This past weekend, we were all together. I was with my parents. We were driving through a neighborhood that we'd never driven through before, and there were all of these American flags out. And there was one house that had a flag, and we were like, oh, what's that flag? I wonder what that flag is. And my mom was like, oh, is it maybe the Palestinian flag? I'm like, no, I'm sure it's not that. And my kiddo says, I think it's a South Sudan flag. And we're like, excuse me? I'm like, just is South Sudan even in its own country? And he's like, yeah, it's its own country. I'm like, think so. Like maybe it's a state within. I don't. And he was like, I think it's its own country, and I think that's the flag. And I was like, all right, well, we actually didn't have internet access, so I was like, all right, well, we'll look that up later. And once we stopped to eat, I Googled it, and I was like, well, hot damn, the flag was actually the Sudanese flag. It wasn't the South Sudanese flag. They're very similar. There's just one line or something that's a little bit different. And South Sudan is its own country. It got its own independence in 2010 or 2011 after I was out of university and I finished my political science education, and I missed the fact that South Sudan became a recognized independent country. So, you know, there you go. There you go. The 10-year-old taught everyone in the car, and we're all fairly politically savvy, right? And I was like, oh, I bet it's because of the genocide happening in Sudan and the problems in Darfur. Like, I knew all of that. I just hadn't realized that the Civil War had actually resulted in two separate, distinct, recognized countries already. Like I thought because there's still so much fighting, it wasn't done yet. But yeah, a perfect example of the fact that it doesn't matter what age they are, they can amaze you with the information they already have.
It's awesome. Very true. I love it.
Yeah.
Too much. Oh, goodness. All right. So we both liked the rubric on page 29. Loved that. I felt like I see a lot of people oftentimes saying, like, well, how do I know what grade to give? Like, I can't give them all A's, can I? Because then it's going to look like a homeschooler who didn't educate their kids if I just give them all A's, right? It'll be like, oh, well, it's because it's your mom, right? So I loved this idea of, and first of all, you can give your kids all A's. I mean, it depends if you've designed a rubric and they've earned all A's, then yes, they got A's, right? But my kiddo does not have solid A's on his transcript. He's got a mix of A's and B's, right? Because even though it was interest-based, I kind of worked on, time, dedication, passion, like certain things like that, since I didn't number grade anything. But if you are looking to create a number grade, there's a beautiful rubric here. And I have a note in the margin there too. Like, I bet ChatGPT could help you build some really cool rubrics as well. I have seen people build some amazing things through Chat where they give it like this huge instruction list, and what it spits out, and it will give you charts, it will give you all kinds of stuff. So I would totally use this as a reference and say, build me one for geometry, or build me, and see what you get back. Because if you're looking for that definitive how to define a grade, that's it. It's awesome.
Yeah, I will say I would be careful about that, only because as an academic homeschooler, I get a lot of rubrics in curriculum or materials that I buy. And the rubrics that are out there and available, especially for like ELA, they are freaking intense.
Oh, really?
Like, they are really, like, they're super overwhelming and intense, in my opinion. And so that was what I loved about this rubric, because this is kind of going back to like what we talked about in our episode earlier this week in our regular podcast. It's excellent, acceptable, not so hot, starting from scratch. And it gives really like easy things to work with. So this is great for a progress if you're doing an essay and you're like wanting to help your kiddo improve from your first draft to your second draft. Like, excellent, the title piques the reader's curiosity by using unique vocabulary words. Acceptable, the title is based on the vocabulary of the essay's content. Not so hot, title reiterates the name of the book or the assignment. Starting from scratch, no title. And so you could easily circle these, and the kid has like easy steps. And I find that generally rubrics that are available on the internet are not so user-friendly. They get a bit more bogged down in those standards, that Common Core verbiage, the things that they're supposed to achieve, and it's not actually nearly as applicable or useful. And that's why I loved this one. I think, like, use this and just tweak it a little for a whole bunch of things. This idea of like really easy, like, action items for your kiddo, like, well, it was only acceptable, and this is what I would like to see to be excellent. So how would you do that? I think it's great. It's a really great rubric.
Oh, nice. That's good to know, because I would be all about, like, I would think that you'd get more similar to this. But if you're saying, no, yeah, don't complicate the situation. Don't make life harder than it needs to be. If that generally is what's out there, don't go crazy. Use this one then. I love that idea.
Yeah, for sure. This is a great example. This might be one of the best things out of the whole book, in my opinion. I put like 3 stickies in blue because that's my kiddo's favorite color. Like, make sure you use this going forward. Like, this is a good resource.
I like that. Yeah. All right, let's see. On 31, I have a note at the very, very bottom that says, Remember, your portfolio is a portrait. The interviewer should see a striking resemblance between the portfolio on his desk and the person sitting across from him. Admissions officials interview hundreds of students per year. They are professionals who will notice any lack of correspondence between what you say and what your portfolio says about you. Keep yourself and your mirror image in alignment. Now, I think a lot of times I don't know that you're always going to have the situation where you're sitting across from the person who's looking at your portfolio. So that to me was a little disjointed, perhaps, because I don't know how often that actually happens. But it did remind me of one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever gotten when it comes to submitting stuff like this. So 2 years ago, my daughter went to this conference in Tennessee, the same conference that she's actually now that's in Kansas. And she had this jam-packed schedule for 10 days of all this stuff she wanted to go to while we were there. And I was there with her, but not attending the conference. That's not what I do. And she had asked me if I would volunteer to be a door minder at some of these lunchtime panel discussions because she wanted the content but couldn't get there because her schedule was packed with other stuff. And so I went and I did my door minder job, and then I would take notes for her in the session. And there was a guy there from Arrowmount School, which is this amazing school that does like trades and things like that. It's really, really cool. And this is what he does. The whole presentation was on filling out for scholarships and grants and stuff. And the panel were all people who read those things. And so they were saying, like, from our perspective, this is what I want to see. And I thought it was so cool. It's one of those things, like you say, Amanda, like it's really simple, but sometimes you need people to say it for it to stick. He said, you should read every single sentence of whatever you submit in isolation. If any other candidate who's applying for the same thing can say that exact same sentence, then you have wasted space in your submission. So he said, like for them, it's an art school. So we get a lot of things. I'm so passionate about art. I'm so this. He's like, don't you think everybody who submits something to us is passionate about art? Like, do you know how many times I see that sentence? And he's like, I got to be honest with you. I go through these things quickly. I'm scanning. I'm looking for certain things that I know I want to see and certain things I know I don't want to see. And so he said, if you're wasting some of your valuable sentences and some of my valuable attention span with stuff that other people can say. So every single thing should be unique to you. And I thought that was a pretty cool tie-in there with that that thought process that your portfolio should represent you to your core and who you are. And if you're doing that, no one else will have a sentence that mirrors yours because it will be so uniquely personal to you and your experience and your goals.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I have a much more generic comment on this page 31 as well. So if you're following along or you have the book and you're, just picking up things because you're like, oh, they're talking about a lot of great things that I might want to copy and use myself, go and read page 31. It just has some good aha moments, those common sense moments like Meagan was just talking about, that it's not revolutionary, but sometimes it's something that you need someone to actually say out loud, or in this case, you need to read. It talks about really focusing in on who's interviewing you and the fact that what you show in your portfolio is going to vary. It's just like a job. You can have one resume that you send to everyone, but your chances of success are going to be a lot less if it's not tailored specifically to what you're looking for. Is it local school administrators, college admissions officials, prospective employers, members of the media for some reason? It just, remember that it needs to be you, but it also needs to match the audience for wherever you're sending it to. So yeah, page 31 just had some really good points of, like, as you're putting this together, think about these things.
I like that.
And then I guess I have the next note on page 34. So on 34, it goes into portfolio basics. We're still talking about mostly portfolios, but it says, who is the storyteller? A portfolio tells the student's story. Parents may start the tale during the middle school years, but by the end of adolescence, the student should be telling it. So I pulled this out specifically, partly because it's true, and I have some other thoughts about some things in this section. But I found the whole definition here helpful, like the way that she finally defines what she means by adolescence, because in this book, she uses that term a lot. And I'm like, what what exactly is adolescence? Like my 10-year-old is not going to be doing a lot of this, but I would consider him in his adolescence. So, and again, it's a little dated. And so the language is maybe a little different than what we would do. So I thought it was helpful to say, like, parents might be starting this at the middle school year. So if you're like me, you've got an elementary age kiddo or a kiddo who's just going into middle school. Yeah, you might be driving a bit more of the portfolio train and, encouraging your kid to build it with you or doing it together, making it collaborative, like we talked about last week. But it isn't until you're getting well into high school that you should be expecting your kid to be able to totally pull together a portfolio all on their own. Like, hey, this is your thing, kid, not mine. So yeah, just being realistic about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I do like that definition because I've heard those terms also. And like, it's kind of like when your kids are little and it's like, well, when are they not a toddler anymore, right? There's some question about when some of these things happen. If it's new, we all kind of use those words all the time, but don't really define them as well. So
Yeah,
like
so just that thing, like, when is that? What exactly are we talking about here?
solidify that for me a little bit. All right, let's see. I had a couple of quick notes. One, there was a quote on page 35 that I liked that said, a portfolio can help round out and put closure on a thematic unit you have been studying. And so it's interesting because my kiddo, before she left for Kansas, maybe a month or 2 months ago, she joined a new Patreon account. Patreon accounts are really cool, by the way, when your kids are a little bit older. Depending on what they're into, there are people who are into the same thing as them who give away like the secret sauce if you pay $10 a month, $20 a month, whatever, and they have live meetings and they have mentorship and all this kind of stuff. And it's really kind of this cool way to get into mentorship in a light way. So she has a Patreon thing for this Nicole so-and-so who's a shoemaker and whatever. And she just joined a Patreon for bookbinding because yes, that's what we were just going back in time. Like we started with spinning yarn and then it was making fabric. And now apparently we're binding our own books. But there's a course she wants to take next summer in London. That's a bookbinding course. And her whole goal in doing it is so that when she'll spend sometimes a year to a year and a half on a particular project. I mean, with such level of detail and research and planning and all this kind of stuff. And she's like, when she's done, she's a weaver. So when she's done, there's fabric, right? And she goes, I would like to bind my notes for the book in my fabric that comes from that and have them all be the same size and all of that so that by the end I have this beautiful bookshelf of like my work. And I was like, well, that's taking portfolio to an extreme, but go girl. I mean, have the best time ever. The school she wants to take the class at is in London and it's one of her shortlist colleges. So we had already been planning to go there and explore it and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, well, taking a class there is really so much better than taking a tour as far as figuring out if the teaching style and the energy and all of that is for you. So I was like, go take bookbinding, have the best time of your life. I'll be kicking around London while you take bookbinding. It'll be great.
Yeah. I will enjoy my time while you enjoy yours doing two very different things.
Exactly. I'll be at Nando's hitting up a little peri peri chicken. It'll be fantastic. So don't mind me.
Yeah.
And then we both have notes on 36. I just, once again, at the top kind of love this piece here. Like portfolios can help them on the road to adulthood by providing opportunities to reflect, self-assess, and make decisions. And I just love how collaborative this is. It's kind of like I have this visual of kind of two buckets of water, right? And at the beginning, our bucket is fuller, and then their bucket, the water level kind of rises and our level kind of diminishes as they kind of take more control and have a better understanding and take more ownership over their things. And it's just, to me, it sounds all so, I just love it. It sounds so beautiful. It's not a top-down system of my way or the highway, me telling you what to do, but there's such beautiful collaboration. I mean, if the goal is to launch them into the world and have them be self-sufficient and successful members of society, this feels like a really great gradual way of moving towards that eventual goal, which I loved.
Yeah, it does sound amazing. Again, I can't imagine a world where it's ever going to happen in my house. And part of that is that my kiddo's a little younger. Part of it is that we're not as inclined to that style. So I don't know. But it does sound magical. I'll give you that. So on that same page, at the bottom of the page, she talks about things that she wouldn't include, but her kids did, and that she gave them the opportunity to justify the inclusion. And it's that thing, whether ultimately it stays in the portfolio or not, I think that's a great skill. And I mean, it gives you great insight into your kiddo, but the ability to justify and argue for your position, to negotiate,
Mm-hmm.
all of those are skills that we practice all the time in our house. I think it's really important for kids to learn how to justify why they think something or why they come down on this way, or to negotiate something they want. There are so many times in our house it's like, well, if that's all you're going to do to ask for what you want, the answer is no. And he knows when I respond that way that he can come back with a proper negotiation strategy and try to get something, and he's got a decent chance at getting somewhere, or he can walk away and it'll just be a no. But like, you put no effort into that. You didn't try to change my mind in any way, shape, or form, and I'm not going to reward that.
I totally
Negotiate.
hear in his head like a video game voiceover that's like challenge accepted, right? Like
That's what I want,
yeah.
like, accept that challenge. Come at me. Come at me. Let's argue this. And the chances are I'll reward you for that.
I highlighted the exact same section for the exact same reason. I loved it. Okay. Oh, you have the next note. Sorry.
Oh, all right. Okay, so on page 37, so just the next page over, it says when parents must be involved. And it's really focusing on a family's freedom to homeschool, which for me is one of those things, again, I felt was a bit like a little bit fear mongering. Oh, they're going to take away your ability to homeschool. And we had talked back in the very beginning in the John Holt book about the fact that that's not that's not really a thing these days. Like, it's really well established legally. The precedent is there. You can homeschool for the most part. But I would argue that the same can be said for applications to elite colleges and universities. And I think that maybe part of this is that difference in the fact that this book is a couple decades old. Like it or not, kids these days aren't usually doing college applications solo, and expecting a kid to be able to get into an elite college or university by doing it completely solo and on their own puts them at a huge disadvantage,
I
right?
agree.
Those even regular colleges and
Mhm.
universities these days, the parents, they're getting tutors and mentors, and they're paying for courses and programs and camps, and it's a big business. And whether you like it or not, if you want your kid to participate in that big business, you need to
Mhm.
be there. You need to
Yep.
help out with that. um, and so that
Yeah.
was one of those things, like, the reality is we're talking about passing it on to the kid and having them be able to do it. And that is all well and good. But for the high stakes things, you need to remember that expecting them to be able to pick that up and carry it on their own when 95% of the other people aren't, it's unfair, and it's setting them up.
Listen, I'm 43 years old. I had a contractor here the other day to look at something. And when he was done with his assessment of the issue, my parents sat with me. My parents live with me, so it's not like I like called them, they drove an hour or whatever. They live with me, but I was like, listen, when the guy explains the thing to me, could you please, just because I would like a second opinion, like it's helpful to have other people's feedback, other people's support through something that could be life changing in the situation that you're giving, or in my case, could be really freaking expensive home repair. Like I need to make sure I'm making the right decision, and so having someone else hear that information firsthand is helpful. There's nothing wrong with asking for help when the stakes are high, or getting a support, or asking somebody to proof something, or having a system of checks and balances to make sure all the deadlines are being made. No, I mean, yeah, for sure. That's a really big. I'm all about allowing kids the space to fail in a safe environment. Yeah, not when it comes to like your entire future or like
Major
physical.
life-changing
Yeah,
decisions. We'll figure it out.
yeah, like I mean, listen. If I have a kid who has zero interest in going to the Ivy League, who isn't prepared for the Ivy League, and I'm the one who's pushing that from behind and being the motivating factor, no. But if I have a kid who's genuinely interested in it, you bet you're behind. I'm going to partner with them to sit down and be like, great, let's figure out what's on you, what's on me, what you need help with, how I can support this. And then we're going to be constantly, touching base and, helping one another and staying. Yeah, for sure. And I'm as loosey-goosey as it gets. But when shit's important, you need to be involved, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's it. When shit's important, you should be involved.
exactly. Yeah. So I just made a note on page 39. There's a little call out box here that says the title is Overwhelmed at the Thought of Creating a Portfolio. And I feel like people are probably listening to this and being like, no shit, Sherlock, I'm freaking busy. And now you're telling me I got to collage magazines and, stuff. They're like, what the hell? Right? Yeah, exactly. Like, these two are just making my job harder. So it says, at first you may feel overwhelmed, assuming you have nothing to show for all of your time spent homeschooling. Then you may become immobilized by the huge quantity of artifacts you discover. Both feelings are perfectly normal. And so it doesn't, in that box, offer any sort of solution or guidance whatsoever, but it validates your feelings. So I wanted to call that out since we're talking about this.
Well, yeah. And the next page was actually my note, which I found helpful for me, right? Because I'm going through this and I'm listening and I'm like, okay, we do a portfolio. We keep a lot of stuff. We have a slimmed down portfolio. So we've got 2 versions, but we don't have most of what she's talking about in here. This idea of like thematic portfolios. We don't like unit studies. We don't do thematic portfolios. Like a lot of this just does not apply to us. But she says, quote, how does the portfolio process fit your child? Some teenagers prefer a more traditional approach to record keeping and assessment. Others can't be bothered reflecting on their life and learning no matter how many opportunities you give them. Still others consider organizing a portfolio too time consuming. If, after a good faith effort, it is clear that the portfolio process is causing a disruption of life and learning, move on. As with any learning tool, they only work if they match your child's personality and learning style. And I just really appreciated that, right? You've got this whole book is about this and about the different ways you can use it and utilize it. And I would say that if you are homeschooling, you have to be using a portfolio and a transcript in some manner or method, right? Whether it's a really bare bones record keeping that you're doing, or it's picture photo album based because you're much more artistic in that way. There's some kind of portfolio that you're keeping, whether you realize it or not. And you're probably going to have to come up with some kind of transcript, whether you want to or not. But it is really reassuring for the author to just say, like, look, this is a tool. This is a tool in your toolbox, just like everything else with homeschooling. And if it works, great. And if it is just not working, it's okay. You hear so much about portfolios and transcripts, and there are other solutions, right? It doesn't have to be, you don't have to mash your head against the wall over and over because it's just not working, right? You can let it go. So I liked that. And then, a few pages later, she starts listing specific types of portfolios. And this is one of those things. It'll be helpful for some. And this is the area that you can say, yeah, oh yeah, we actually do that. Or like, nope, don't need that. Don't need that. Never going to use that. Like, oh, actually, yeah, I didn't realize it, but I do. I already have this kind. I have a progress portfolio because we were working on something and he's got a first draft and a second draft and a third draft. And I kept them all so that he could see he was actually making progress. So he could read the first version and the final version and feel proud of that. Hey, guess what? You kept a progress portfolio.
Yeah, you're like, I didn't even know I was doing it and I've done it. Oh, I'm good. I like that. That's fantastic. So we talked a minute ago about being overwhelmed by the potential of portfolio systems, right? And there's a note that I made on page 51 that talked about an informal daily recording system, which is basically just at the end of the day, jotting down whatever it is that you did that day. And I think you've talked about doing that before, Amanda, that you like having kind of a daily thing. And I thought that could be kind of like a baby steps towards portfolio, right? Where it's just every day, and then that process might work for you, that process might grow, that process might evolve into portfolio building, but it seems like just kind of a nice baby step component if you're sitting there going, how the hell do I even begin starting this? Okay, well, here we go. This might be a way to start.
Yeah, and that can be whatever it needs to be for you, right? You could go out and get one of those fancy planners that you always see. There's homeschool planners. It could be just a paper calendar that you use and you write down kind of what you've done. For me personally, I preferred an Excel spreadsheet, and I created an Excel spreadsheet that we write down the numbers so we know what we're supposed to do, and then we write down the numbers for the date that we actually did each thing, and then it's got space at the bottom where we can write in the museums we did or extra documentaries we watched or things like that, right? And I can cross things out, and there's a spot where it's like out school class or online class, depending on which extra provider we're using or things like that. It can look however you want. It can be as organized as you want it to be. If you need more structure to make sure you fill it out, that was me, right? I bought a few different organizers and planners, and they sat empty, like that's not true. The first like 3 or 4 pages were great, right? And then life happened and I filled out nothing else. So I needed something that was much more structured. And so for me, I changed it to this is what I think we're going to do. And for the most part, I'm just kind of checking things off each time we get it done. And then I can write in a few extra words about like, oh, we watched this, we did that, we went to this museum kind of thing. That makes it easier for me. Whatever makes it easier for you, like this is supposed to make your life easier. I know it feels like we're telling you to do more because you have endless amounts of time. You're not busy at all. But really, we're trying to make life easier.
Exactly.
All right. So, does this put us? Are we almost at our last comments? Oh my gosh,
we survived, and it's not a 3-hour episode.
How about that? All right. So, I'm going to wrap up here with our last book-related comments. On page 52, there's a quote that I pulled out. It says, "As homeschoolers, we tend to focus on the fact that learning occurred, not when it happened. Yes, a date can add credibility to an artifact, or even just help us remember more about the learning and when it was taking place. Like if your brain works like mine, right? A lot of times I can't remember. And so I'll be like, what, when, and then like once I remember when it happened or what we did, I'm like, oh yeah, that was when we did blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And we had this with that, right? So dates can help. But the author says, I have still found it wise to add those dates in either pencil or with a sticky note. And I was like, oh, that's a really good idea, right? A sticky note, especially so you can pull it off if you need. You can, if you're a visual person, you can use different color sticky notes as you're organizing and trying to figure out what you want to do or how you want to do it. So that thing, sometimes you do need dates. And sometimes, you'll realize like, oh, damn, I need an example of this. And I don't have a good one from this year, but I know we covered it last year, and who actually really cares? Because we covered it last year and it doesn't actually matter. So you slide it in, like that's okay. And if you put your date in pencil or with a sticky note, then you did it this year. We're not trying to cheat the system, but the reality is you have flexibility in homeschooling.
Well, and what's the ultimate goal? For the kid to know the information. If the kid knows the information, it's not cheating, right?
Yeah.
Like that's just kind of my bottom line all the time, right? Done.
Yeah. That's a great rule of thumb. And that was, this section kind of wraps up with, it says how much to save. If you talked about it, save it. If it looks interesting, save it. If you can't get another one, save it. And now that kind of has you saving a lot of stuff. And if you're in a small space, you're like, I don't actually have an extra office to just save all of my homeschool crap. But it is kind of a good rule of thumb to just think about, if it was particularly interesting, if you talked about it and your kiddo was really interested in it, if it was something that you thought it was worth mentioning to a friend or a family, this project or this thing they did, save it. You might find, that you need to use it in this process.
Mm-hmm. I know, because that's a question that comes up often. Like, how much of this stuff do I save?
Yeah. Yeah. And quickly followed by I don't have an extra room, or I don't have an entire shed that I can,
right.
Where am I going to, I have crap coming out of my ears.
I know, because you've talked about your space being small. We've moved every 2 years. I'm like, I'm not schlepping this stuff all over the country, right? I mean, not happening. Well, that is going to wrap up our discussion for chapters 1 through 3, which it took us a while to get through. Hopefully next week, 4 to 5, we're going to be on fire. We'll be doing good. So that'll wrap us up. But here's our little goodbye message for the day. If you love us and you enjoy listening to us, and we know we adore you, we have a Buy Us a Coffee account if you're at all interested in ever contributing to our podcast efforts. Our Buy Us a Coffee link can be found in the description of our podcast. It's on our Instagram bio. It's all over the place. So we always love a good cup of coffee. So thank you so much for your support. We're so glad you're here, and we hope you have an awesome rest of your day. Happy homeschooling.
Yeah, have a great one.